My name is Erin Hancock. I work with the WSCF, that's the World Student Christian Federation in the United States, as the national organizer. My pronouns are they or she. I'm calling in tonight from Chicago, Illinois on occupied Potawatomi land. For those of you that don't know or aren't familiar with the WSCF, just a little bit of background. The World Student Christian Federation is a network of student Christian movements that exists in over 90 countries around the world that works to support students as they explore their faith while working for justice and peace in the world. And we're so excited to host this conversation tonight. And I invite you all to introduce yourselves in the chat box. If you would like to, you can tell us your name, your pronouns, and where you're calling from, your land acknowledgement. This is a conversation, so we would love to know who is joining us tonight. And just a couple of announcements before we get started. As I mentioned in the email that went out earlier, there is language interpretation available for tonight, and I would ask that everyone on this call, regardless of what language you would like to listen in, go to the icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen that says interpretation, and then select the language in which you would like to listen. So even if you are an English speaker and listening to this in English, go ahead and select that in case we do end up having questions from other folks, and we'll need to make sure that we have the interpretation set up for that. So just again, everyone click that interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and then select the language you would like to listen in. You also have the option to mute original audio if you would like. If the audio in the background is distracting, you can mute the original audio. Otherwise, it's going to be there in about like 80% volume. The other instruction I want to give you is regarding closed captioning. So we do have closed captioning for this conversation tonight. You can turn that on. There's 3 buttons in your Zoom toolbar that say more, and you can either enable the subtitles or you can hide the subtitles if you find them to be distracting. If they're covering your screen, you can also remove them that way, but they are available if you would like to have those. Just again, a note that we are recording this conversation, so there is a chance that your video might appear in the recording. If you don't want that to happen, there is a way to prevent that. You can turn off your video. There's a button in the bottom left of your screen that says stop video, and you can hide yourself that way. I would also just ask that you mute yourself when you're not speaking so that we can minimize background noise and make sure that we hear those who are sharing. So those are all of the announcements that I have for you all. Again, it's so good to be with you tonight. I'm so excited for this conversation. At this point, I have the privilege of introducing our panelists and moderator for this conversation tonight. With us, we have Reverend Dr. Patrick Cheng. And the Reverend Dr. Patrick Cheng is an Episcopal priest, a theologian, and an attorney. He is the author of 3 books on queer theology, including Radical Love, an introduction to queer theology, which has been translated into Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. Father Cheng serves as an adjunct professor of Anglican studies at the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary, and as the theologian in residence at St. Thomas Church, 5th Avenue in New York City. He holds a Ph.D. from Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York, studying under the late Dr. James H. Cone, and a JD from Harvard Law School, and a BA from Yale College. And if you would like to learn more about Father Cheng, Patrick, as he's asked us to call him tonight, you can go to his website at www.patrickcheng.net. And then we have with us Nordia Bennett, who is a Womanist scholar, holistic spiritual educator, and a recent graduate of Union Theological Seminary. Nordia believes the revelation of God is here and now on earth, waiting to be experienced. When she is not working, she enjoys a cozy cafe setting to drink matcha lattes with oat milk. You can also catch her binge watching the latest Netflix show. It is their joy to design pleasurable, participatory experiences where community is cultivated and people have freedom to make different choices with new knowledge. And then we have Carter Baxter, who is a chaplain resident serving hospital patients, families, and staff at Mount Sinai, Beth, Israel in New York City. They recently completed their M.Div at Union Theological Seminary, and they're now pursuing ordination in the United Church of Christ. Carter loves growing food, making music, and spending Saturdays at the dog park with his spouse and their dog. And finally, we have our moderator for this evening, Nathan Samayo. who is a Master of Divinity candidate at Harvard Divinity School, currently seeking ordination in the United Church of Christ. He was born in Guam and grew up in Tacoma, Washington. His research and practitioner interests include how post-colonial and postmodern theologies may influence contemporary pastoral care and counseling practices. He centers the narratives, memory, and modern experiences of Pacific Islanders under the legacy of US imperialism, militarism, and environmental catastrophe. Ethan currently serves as a youth pastor in Ipswich, Massachusetts, a research assistant for Harvard Peabody Museum Oceania Department, and a student coordinator for Harvard University's Committee on Ethnicity, Migration, and Rights. This conversation is especially important to him because as someone who identifies as gay, he is inspired by the expansion of our understanding of God's inclusive vision of belovedness in the bodies of queer people. So with that being said, I invite you, you're welcome to begin typing questions that you have for our panelists into the chat box, and I will collect those as we engage in this conversation. But without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Nathan.
Awesome, thank you, Erin. Y'all, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you find yourself. I love these WSCF conversations because this is an international conversation, right? This is a space of bridge building and really thinking critically all together about how we may experience God and what God's vision for the world is. And I think we should just jump in. There's a lot to be talked about today, so I'm super excited to kind of start us off with the first question. And panelists, please feel free to jump in, but we're gonna go ahead and start with Patrick on this first question. So Patrick, I'm curious, what is queer theology to you? And what does queerness have to do with Christian theology?
Well, thank you, Nathan, and thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. It's a real honor and delight to be here. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So I think, the question that you asked, Nathan, in terms of, queer theology and, what queerness has to do with Christian theology, I think, theology, if it's about talking about God or the word about God, it's sort of the talking about God, in relationship to queerness. And basically, the word queer has so many different definitions, right? I think most people, when they think about it in terms of sexual or gender identities, but I'm actually more interested in queerness as things that are strange, things that are marginalized, things that are non-binary, and things that have identities without an essence, right? And I think for all four of those, Christianity is very strange. The word became flesh. The creator of the universe becoming a person is pretty strange, right? In terms of marginalization, what the gospel is about the least among us. Non-binary, we'll probably have a chance to talk more about Christology in that sense. And then identity without essence, the eschatological final destination of us all is sort of an identity without an essence. So we can explore that more, but I think that, queerness has everything to do with Christianity.
Awesome, thank you, Patrick. And Nordia or Carter, any words from y'all?
Yes, I really would second what you were saying, Patrick, about queerness having everything to do with Christian theology. I understand God to be alive and evolving and moving and present here now and in the future, creating here now and in the future. And I think seeking to be in relationship with a God who is so expansive and so beyond language, so beyond our understanding, seeking to be in relationship with a God who is like so just like complicated and like every gender, no gender, and every word we can ever think of and like nothing we can describe, is that relationship is so queer, and that God is so queer. And being a Christian or being a person of faith requires so much imagination on our parts that our queerness teaches us how to do, to imagine something that is just beyond our reach, to imagine something that is different from what we've seen in our day-to-day lives. And so queerness and Christianity really go hand in hand for me.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think of queer theology, because growing up, it wasn't even a thing that I thought about. But I think now that I am evolving and figuring out what it even means to be a Christian, first of all, I think at the center of queer theology for me is being a Black woman. And what does that particularly look like with my lens as a cis Black woman in America that believes in God, that is queer, that grew up with Caribbean parents from Jamaica? And what does that even have to, how does queer theology hold that? And I think, as Carter has elaborated, and Pastor Patrick, I'm just gonna call you Pastor Patrick, has elaborated on the expansiveness and the possibilities of it is what carries me and gives me hope that God can carry my mess, or what I even call my mess. Like, I don't know what my mess is, but what I call humanity's mess, God can hold that. And one thing I think about often, or at least as I was preparing for tonight, I thought of knowing that queer theology, that we can make something new out of something someone thought was not useful. And often I think of, like, in the Black community, our ancestors, after they've like eaten the pig, you know, slave masters, they've eaten the pig, and then they give their enslaved servants, they give them the leftovers, and they give them, and they make a delicacy now that they call chitlins. And it is the pig's intestines. It is we don't know to know that process, but the fact that they have been able to cultivate a new relationship to a food that has been despised and has been disregarded and given off, that's just left over there to the side, and you could do whatever you want with it. But the fact that they made something beautiful out of it, and I think that's queer theology, is that we can speak life to death, and like we speak that every single day, and queer theology holds that and holds the complexity of my identity and who I want to be in the future. And so I could go on and on, but we'll get into that later. But yes, that's what queer theology is for me.
Yo, that's so good. And you know, when I read that question, after I said it, I was like, yo, this question is that big. So I'm excited for the following questions, right? To where we can kind of dig into the roots of what everybody is saying. And I'm so grateful for the diverse amount of experiences that are being brought to the table right now. But yeah, I kind of want to jump into this next question, and hopefully this can get down to the how we experience Jesus and Jesus' ministry. But how do y'all see queerness reflected in the life and ministry of Jesus? Say that one more time. How do you see queerness reflected in the life and ministry of Jesus? And Nordia, may we start this off with you? Okay, or we can think about it, whoever is open. I'm just kind of popcorn in, but whoever is down to answer this question first. I know this is something we got to sit with for a little bit.
I mean, I'm happy to just sort of put something out there. I mean, I also do want to mention, thank you, Nordia, for social location, and Carter about the expansiveness of God. I just want to point out just, you know, this whole notion of orthodoxy versus radicalness. I mean, you know, the central question in Christian theology has always been, you know, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem, right? And for the longest time, people thought philosophy had nothing to do with, you know, theology or Christian faith. And even Aquinas was pretty radical, right, in trying to weave together what he was doing. And so I think that Christian theology always evolves. And I think we are on the cusp, or have been doing something wonderfully new. In terms of Jesus and Christology, you know, I referred to this earlier about sort of the non-binary nature of Jesus. You know, my notion of radical love is a love that is so strong that it dissolves binaries, right? So when you're thinking about for me, about Jesus, about bringing together the divine and the human, right? You've got sort of the word made flesh, the divine and the human, but you also have sort of collapsing death and life from Good Friday to Easter Sunday. And then you have sort of the notion of the sovereign who is, enslaved, right? I mean, all of these binaries get collapsed and dissolved in the person of Jesus Christ. And so to me, if you think of queerness as being resisting binaries, whether it's gender binaries or sexual binaries, I mean, how can Jesus not be more queer in that sense? And so that is my Christology of queerness, if you will.
I think just to add on to that, I think that's kind of something I've been thinking about, is the materiality of the body and how that places us with Jesus. And like, the word became flesh. And so you can't tell me our bodies do not matter. And so what that then tells me is I matter. And like Jesus's participation in community mattered, and how it just became this like influx of everything, and like not being able to name things because Jesus done turned everything upside down, and you're like, wait, what is happening? And Jesus is like, yes, this is the point of why I'm here. And so I'm particularly thinking of M. Sean Copeland in Flesh and Freedom, and I love her. And she talks about marked bodies and how we carry identities with us, like our race, class, gender, sexuality, and how by Jesus being with us, Jesus took on those marked bodies with us. And so, like, although we're not talking about like the sexuality of Jesus, but I think we are talking about the sensuality of that nature and what it means to personify love. And that's like the meaning, I guess, for me is queerness. Like, how do we see love in a very like personified way that's not just, oh, I love you, but in a way that Jesus didn't just say, oh, we are inclusive, we're diversity, but Jesus said, I'm concerned about your life, and how can I be with you, and like, how can I help us, not just me, have an abundant life. And so when we think about the queering nature of like Jesus's ministry, Jesus's body is what makes it queer, like him being with us and breaking the barriers between like the transcendent and the immanent, and saying it's all clashing and it's all becoming one. And my main concern is that I want us to be transformed in the middle of evil principalities, as you said. Listen, the evil people at the core, and disrupting them. And like, I think that's the queerness of it, the disruption, and how we shake people. We shake people to their core because we make them look at themselves. And people don't like looking at themselves. And so I'm going to stop there because I know Carter got some good stuff for us too. And so that's what I just want to say: disruption, and participation. That's what I'm going to leave it at right now.
Yes. Yes to every single thing you said. Like, my screen is falling all over the place. I'm sorry, everybody. But just Jesus inherently being someone who's turning everything upside down, who's literally flipping the tables and saying, the system doesn't work. The way we're doing things doesn't work. This is not serving people. This is serving power instead. And that is not acceptable. The way that that Jesus on Palm Sunday, like, comes into the city on a donkey and says, like, the way that we're thinking of power doesn't work and hierarchy doesn't work. And we need collective movement. We need to gather together in the streets. We need to be showing up for each other and building community together and subverting this empire that is harming people and colonizing people and excluding people, putting people in the boxes and dividing us from one another. So in that sense, I just, I think in so many ways, Jesus is just like one of the queerest role models that like we can even think of just in every aspect of the word. I'm also thinking about the ways that Jesus shows us how to build chosen community, chosen family. I think of the rituals that Jesus teaches us, baptism, communion, and how those are like radical ways of claiming each other, claiming someone as inherently loved through baptism, as inherently belonging, as inherently necessary and important and sacred. And in my tradition, like when you're a baby, before you even like have had a chance to, you know, do anything or earn that, you are worthy and you belong. And in communion, the act of sharing with one another and caring about one another and sharing a meal, transforming something as ordinary as bread and wine into something that like just becomes more than anything we could ever understand, like sharing material needs like food, sharing spiritual nourishment around a table. And in the Last Supper, Jesus shows us how to continue expanding that table, how to always be looking for like, how do we add more chairs? How do we make the table longer? How do we like throw the table out and like go gather outside so everyone can be there? Like those ways of drawing in everybody and like always thinking about how we can make room for everyone. Those are things that we practice as queer people and that are central to our Christian faith.
Thank you for that, Carter, and for everyone. Wait, Nordia, were you gonna say something or? Oh, okay, cool. Y'all, this is so good. I just realized I'm in a room full of union folks, so I gotta come see what's good over there. This is really touching my heart, y'all. I'm grateful for y'all. So yeah, we're gonna hop into the next question, but just to let everyone know, I'm looking on the other side of my screen because this is where all the questions are live. But the next question that I have for y'all, and hopefully we can speak into a little bit more about what y'all do as kind of practitioners and educators. But really the question is, how does queerness shape your ministry, right? So maybe as a priest or a spirituality educator and coach, and also as a chaplain, like how does queerness really show in the ways that y'all do ministry practically, and also how maybe y'all think about it theoretically and how those kind of intersect. And this is a question for everyone who wants to start us off.
I'd be glad to take a try at this. So I'm a chaplain resident at Mount Sinai, Beth Israel Hospital here in New York City. And my work, I primarily serve 3 different units on the hospital floors. I work with palliative care patients who are sometimes near the end of life, but always just juggling multiple diagnoses or health concerns or chronic conditions, or juggling pain treatment, pain management. So that's one of my units. I also serve patients on the behavioral health floor. And I also serve patients who are transgender or gender nonconforming and are coming in for gender affirming surgery or just general health care. So between those 3 units and like other patient visits that I do, people bring a variety of needs and experiences and contexts to our conversations. And so I'm always trying to sharpen my skills of learning how to listen to what somebody needs and what they're carrying with them that day, and how I can be of support. And I see one of my most important jobs as a chaplain as being someone who's queering the hospital space, someone who's opening room for conversations and conversations and like connection and storytelling that otherwise doesn't happen in the like hubbub of the clinical environment. And so I often sort of think of chaplaincy in some ways as being similar to like a queer relationship where you're meeting somebody new and you're figuring out like how to meet each other where you're at. And sort of as a chaplain, when I am meeting a patient and I don't know much about their life, it's on my mind to sort of pay attention to like, where's your trauma? Like, where's your pain today? Like, where's your joy and your hope? Where are your sources of strength right now when you're when you're isolated from your community, or when you are always living in a sense of isolation from community or connection? And how can I show up for you in a way that is safe for you, is empowering for you, centers your voice, so that you have more space to be fully yourself here as you are advocating for your own care? And how can I support you in advocating for that care?
Particularly a little, I was talking to Aaron about this, holistic spiritual educator. I think it's really interesting because I'm not currently working in a traditional framework of a church right now as a youth pastor, and I'm more so trying to build my own path because I don't want to, like, I love the Lord, I love God. I will be at a church any day, like when the call's right. But I think I'm trying to build a path that acknowledges the reimagination that's possible, that is antithetical to capitalism, and how can I make room that's honoring my work without having to pay the bills. You know, we got to pay the bills, but I just want to be able to work in a way that's honest and true. And so that looks like me creating my own workshops, and I currently did a workshop on Saturday, reimagining the erotic and self-care, and that particularly looked at Audre Lorde and how do we reimagine the erotic and use it in our lives, and like how is that queerness? That's everything to do with my queerness, because everything apart, the parts of me that I closed off, or I was closed off to the world, and I didn't feel comfortable in my body. And I really feel like I couldn't relate to people. I couldn't open myself up to people. I don't even think I really had real relationships with folk. But it was the moment, I blame Union. The moment I went to Union, everything shifted. Things made sense. And like, that's my work. And if that's not queerness, then I don't know what is. But that is to say, I am in the business of allowing other people feel full in their bodies and make them allow our human experiences to be as pleasurable as possible, because I know God wants us to be on God's playground, on her playground that we call Earth, and we should be roaming free, and we should be doing what we need to do. We should be liberated. We should be doing everything that we want to do on this earth while we're here, right? And so I think how that opens up my queerness is because I want us all to be everything. Like I want everybody to live out full. And so that's what I think queerness has given my work the ability to do that. And honestly, being able to see how in like nonprofits and how that doesn't have space sometimes. And that has a lot to say on what the evil powers that be want certain people want our lives to be like. And I don't think God intended that for us. I don't think my queerness intended that for me. And it was funny, someone said, my queerness is a gift from God. And why are you afraid to accept this gift of queerness from God? And I said, why would God give me the gift of queerness? And I see why. Because we live a particular life where we know we matter and we don't have to settle for anything less. And so that's how my queerness relates to my role as like an educator and an educator to LGBTQ youth. I particularly work with youth working through their religious baggage, providing space for them, and providing like them the ability to know that you can make choices and choices are available to us. And I think people may be like, oh my goodness, that's like an easy concept. That's not an easy concept. It's not. Coming from my conservative background with my choices were not a thing. It was either you believed that God was the way maker or not. And for me, my queerness gives me the ability to nuance everything and complicate everything, because that is the point of life, to complicate it. And I think God gives me the ability to do that, to break the barriers, to come against the like binaries that be, to name things, to name that spirit, right? And to let it be known, and sometimes not name the spirit. Like sometimes you just gotta let it be and not carry on my business. So as an educator, I do have a lot of range. So I can go, listen, I could do a lot of things, and I do continue to preach, and I do continue to work with particular organizations that want consulting, or they want different ways of being in community with each other in their organization. So that's what I do. Reimagination, if I was going to put in one word.
Yeah, I just also want to put in a plug for Union. You know, Dr. James Cone, the late Dr. Cone, was my doctoral advisor, and he helped me find my voice. And, you know, taking classes from Dolores Williams and, you know, working with Kelly Brown Douglas. I mean, it's just an amazing community. But I do remember Dr. Cone saying to me, you know, once we talked about what one of his favorite passages was in scripture. And, you know, in addition to like the Exodus stuff, like 1 Corinthians, right? That God uses, right, the weak to shame the strong, right? Or the foolish to shame the wise. And, you know, in terms of my own ministry, just really remembering what is foolish and what is weak, and how that is a window into the divine is really important for me. As an Episcopal priest, you know, I grew up Roman Catholic, and growing up, I wanted to be a priest, you know, like play Eucharist, you know, with grape juice and Wonder Bread and all that. But, you know, when I realized I was gay, I just, you know, thought I was intrinsically disordered and that would never be a path. And so I just went on and became a lawyer. But, you know, thank goodness God never gave up on me. I think the Episcopal tradition that I found myself in, the non-binaries I was talking about, right? The Episcopal Church was born out of a synthesis of Catholicism and Protestantism and Reform. And so it is in that synthesis that I think there's something about sort of living in that middle space or gray that many Episcopal folks are comfortable in. And a shout out to the Episcopal folks that have introduced themselves. But also, you know, the importance of sacrament, right? You know, Carter talking about, you know, Eucharist and sacrament. I think the very nature of sacrament and just sort of how embodied that is, right? That the taste of the bread and the wine, the smell of the incense, the sight of the beautiful vestments. I mean, I sort of have an Anglo-Catholic perspective of things, but I think that's very queer too in terms of being embodied. And so I think, you know, I just also want to mention, I guess, Nathan, you'll be getting into sort of the chat box, but folks have asked some really good questions about sin and all that. And just want to say I wrote my doctoral dissertation on sin, rethinking sin from a queer perspective. And so, you know, being a theologian, I love being able to join together traditional concepts with, you know, our current social locations. So.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for sharing. I love this conversation because there's something about talking about queerness that really opens up the opportunity to be more authentic and vulnerable. And y'all have exemplified that in this conversation. And I hope we can continue to do that with the amazing questions that people are actually submitting. So I think we're going to go ahead and jump into that. This is a mixture of questions that were submitted before the panel, and then also ones that are coming into the chat. And a lot of folks are actually talking about queerness and also kind of religious trauma and church trauma. So I just want to set a disclaimer that we're going to start diving into some intense and heavy topics that have a huge impact. And I'm super grateful that we can hold each other with grace and gratitude for being vulnerable. So this is another question coming up about religious trauma. And this one says, how do you bridge the divide between Christian LGBTQ plus people, allies, and the LGBTQ plus people who have been traumatized by the church? Let me ask that one more time. How do you bridge the divide between LGBTQ plus allies and LGBTQ plus people who have been traumatized by the church?
I can say a little bit. I know my experience in terms of working with the LGBTQA plus community. There has been so much trauma, and honestly, sometimes it's harder for me to come out as Christian, right, in many of those communities, but rightly so. And I certainly have been traumatized. Just anyone who understands sitting in a pew, just being totally nervous that the preacher is going to start just going on about, just how awful and intrinsically disordered you are. I think a few things. I think humility is important. Just knowing that we don't all have the answers, and maybe a sense of apologizing for the harm that we have done, listening and walking with people and giving people the space to talk about how they have been hurt, but also a sense of hope, right? That folks are not alone, and that many people have wrestled with these questions. And so I think just, like pastoral care, right? Like it's not so much about like finding answers, but in my view, it's about like either gardening, watering the plant and letting the plant grow, or just being with someone and accompanying them on the journey. So those are just some thoughts I had.
For me, I'm really glad that folks are asking this question, because I think it's just like central to this conversation. For me, as a trans, queer Christian who is a chaplain in a secular setting, I never know what baggage a patient has, or a staff member, or a family member when I'm walking into a conversation. I never know what relationships a person has with religion or spirituality, and I never know like what their family members are saying about them, and I never know like how their family members are using dogma to justify or harm something that the patient is going through. And so for me, I think one of the most important things that I can do as a chaplain is to make a ton of space for someone to say no to the conversation, to just say no to me visiting, and to just, not to just like take that at its word. Like, I think when you're in the hospital or in like a crisis situation, there's so many things that are out of your control. And like when you're a patient, there's so many people all day long who are coming in and sort of demanding your time and energy and are asking a lot of things of you. And I think it's really important as a chaplain to be someone who's like a really low stakes person to say no to. Like there's no real implications. it can be a lot harder to say no to your doctor or to your nurse or to medication or a procedure. And so I don't know, I think when I talk with folks who are queer and are religious and like want to work through those relationships, to that intersection together and the trauma that they might have together, I'm like, then that's a different situation. And it's so important to me to just like go at their pace and like ask permission every step of the way, and like, you know, put the ball in that person's court and just follow their lead, and try to be as present and transparent as I can be. Because yeah, people are really dealing with a lot, and those of us who are queer and are like actively engaged with Christianity, it can just be really triggering all the time. Like even if your faith is really important to you and you feel like you've worked a lot of it out, and you feel really like comfy with who you are and your relationship with God, like there still can be random stuff that comes up that just really like throws you for a loop. So I think those of us who are queer Christians, like we just have to be so gentle with ourselves too, and pay attention to like how we're doing and how our pain can show up in our relationships and how we engage with other people as well.
Thank you, Carter. Drops mic. What can I say after that? This is a really like sensitive topic for me because I'm still working through it. And I'm not sure if there's even a divide really, and the divide is in ourselves, and we have to wrestle with that every single day. And it's hard when you love God and then someone else tells you that you don't. So I would just say you have to carry yourself with the biggest grace that you can give yourself and the grace that you allow God to give you. Because as James said in the chat, thank you for saying that, God didn't do it to me. It was people. And so, yeah, that's all I can contribute to that conversation.
No, thank you. I have a lot of words, but no, I'm thankful that y'all are recognizing the real the heavy impact that traumatization plays, especially with queer people experiencing church or queer folks experiencing a ministry or in those spaces. And you know, there's a lot of folks kind of in the chat box right now who are asking this kind of practical question around what it looks like to support folks who have been traumatized by the church and hold space for folks who have been traumatized by the church. Someone also added, what does it look like? This might be a kind of large conversations that also overlap, but queer Christians and also like indigenous people who have been traumatized by the history and the legacy of church in the US and across the world. But what does it really look like to support and hold space for folks who have experienced that kind of traumatization from the church? And as I ask that question, if things come up for folks, we invite you to send a personal message to both me or Aaron. If there's any processing you would like after that, we recognize that these are kind of loaded questions and there's a lot of baggage that can be carried when we talk about and have this conversation. And also if any of the panelists have any resources that you would just like to touch up on that you might want to offer to the people who are listening, I also welcome that. But yeah, just that question is, how do you support and hold space practically, or also just ways to do that for people who have been traumatized by the church and by Christians? And feel free, if you do have something to offer, we welcome that, but also this is something that someone else answered and you have no words, no need to jump in, but what just any words that y'all have to offer.
I mean, I would just say a lot of what we've already talked about in terms of just acknowledging, being with people, going at their own pace, giving permission to say no. But I do think it is contextual and depends on individuals. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that there is a deep spiritual yearning too. There is pain. And I will say that, I was practicing as a lawyer, and I sort of pushed down all my desire to love God, as Nordia was saying, because I was told that, that was not for me. And I was walking on the street and I saw a flyer for a class in biblical Hebrew during the summer to be offered at Union Seminary. And I could not get that flyer out of my head. And I thought, well, why don't I just check that out? And I went there and I fell in love. I didn't have to check my brain at the door. And so I'm just saying, in addition to sort of recognizing the trauma, also recognizing the deep desire and the places where you can reconnect as much as you've been pained, not to take away from that. But I will say that, reconciliation is not easy. But I just, I appreciate so much all the questions and comments that are coming up in the chat box also.
I would also say it's okay to leave for a little bit. It's okay to walk away. And I walked away. And then I came back. And also to add to Pastor, everything he said, but continue to show up for yourself, because you would be surprised as to what will come out of you when you keep going and asking the Spirit, I need you to show me some things, help me. And also a practical way, community. If it was not for my chosen family to keep me and to pray with me and to let me know I am seen and I am heard and that they love me, shout out to Aaron, I will not be here, because they're the ones that kept my faith when I wanted to throw it away. And so you need to have, oh, it's such a cliche when growing up. They're like, where's your prayer, where your prayer circles at? No, but really, where's your people? Where are your people that are going to hold you and hold your faith for you as you go wrestle and then come back? And then maybe you don't want to come back. Maybe you decide, this is actually, I want to throw the whole thing away. But one thing we've had to learn at Union Theological Seminary, that it was, you're going to have to take some things off. That's what they said our first year. You got to take some things off. You got to put things to the side, and you have to decide for yourself what makes sense for you and what feels good for you. And then you start putting things back. And then you start going back to your church home and getting some spirituals and rituals that you loved as a kid that felt good for you, but you want to put down this. You want to put down that. And I think that's the space your community gives you, is that space to work it out. And I honestly, I'm sorry if this is not like everyone wants that answer. And I think in my process, I wanted every single person to tell me what to do. Like, how do I do this? How do I get through this pain? How do I get to the other side? And I'm telling all y'all 48 people on this Zoom call, no one gave me the answer that I needed or wanted to hear. It had to be me. It was trial and error. It was trial and error until I'm still trial and erroring everything, but at least I'm in a better space than I was before. And so when you're thinking about, how do you hold space, you have to decolonize space. And I can't do that for you. You have to do that for yourself. So a lot of the things that we're talking about today, I think I just want to uplift that even a pastor, the chaplain, and the educator don't have the answers. But guess what? You have your answer, and that should be good enough for you. So I just want to hold that up too as we're talking about this.
Yeah, I am such a believer in like our bodies knowing what we need, like our bodies knowing what our limits are, and our spirits knowing what our limits are. And I think like when you're dealing with trauma, you have to be able to recognize in your body like what stuff does not feel good, and like how to give yourself space from that and give yourself breaks, and how to notice the things that do feel good and do feel freeing and liberating. And like, I don't know, there's just, everybody's different, but like whatever ways you can like find little opportunities in your week or your day to make a little more space for those things that feel really freeing, and that give you more room to be yourself. And maybe you don't have a ton of people that you can do that with, but just starting from somewhere, and carving out that space for yourself at first, and just taking it at your own pace. And for people who are like allies, who are like faith leaders or church members and stuff, my spouse has this saying that she says that everyone has the right to sit in the back pew, or to sit in the entryway, or to sit outside the front door, or on the front steps. And so I think if you're not queer or you don't have religious trauma in the same way, just like recognizing that people are doing what they can, and respecting when people need to just sort of like sneak in on the side and then like head home afterward, and recognizing that people are engaging as much as they're able to in this moment, and celebrating that. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks y'all for that. We had a few more questions that came up kind of around theological concepts. And this first question goes, are there theological concepts that your queerness has enhanced and deepened? Maybe we can sit with that, or what theological concepts that come up for y'all.
I can say something from my perspective. This came up before, but really wrestling with the notion of sin and feeling that it's not something, sort of, as I put it, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. How do we wrestle authentically with sin that can be sort of a force? I mean, evil is real in this world, right? But, I think I've learned a lot from feminist theologians that have said, all right, the traditional masculine notion of sin is pride, right? You lift yourself up too high. But feminist theologians have said, sin is also not lifting yourself high up enough, right? That you think you're not good enough like anyone else. And so that sort of, I alluded to this, my whole doctoral project was thinking about how do we sort of preserve that concept, but not, honor it, but not throw it out. And so, some things, like the closet is sin, right? If we think about Jesus as being God coming out, right? The revelation of God, I mean, sin is opposing Christ. And I think you could argue that the closet is sin. Now, granted, different contexts, people may not be safe to come out. But what I mean is that sin is not necessarily just a laundry list of stuff, but it really is in relation to what Jesus expresses. And so, you know, I think if I were not queer myself, I don't think I would have wrestled as deeply with some of these concepts that have so often been used to hurt many people. So.
Nordia, I saw your mic go on. I can share briefly. One concept that is really important to me as a trans person, as a queer person, is Imago Dei, the idea that people are made in the image of God. For me, you know, like the more I can stretch my imagination to like think of like all that God can be, the more room I make for myself too. And, you know, I'm like such a believer that like the parts of us that are messy and fluid and changing and like hard for people to understand or like hard for people to make sense of, those are the parts that are pointing to God. Those are the parts that like echo the mystery that God has. And those are the parts that like we gotta listen to and make more room for, and really take care of in ourselves.
Love that. I think I've been working through the Eucharist, and particularly with the Womanist theology, and I worked it out, I think, a little bit with my thesis. I wrote about God being in the barbershop. So I wrote barbershop theology, reimagining the Eucharist and the transformative nature of the body, and how God is in the barbershop through our expression of our hair, and how we need to be able to dismantle this binary between the sacred and the profane, the sacred and the profane, and just understanding like everything is sacred. Like we are sacred, like our bodies are sacred. So in the Black community, the barbershop and our hair salon is the epicenter of Black cultures, the epicenter of what it even means to be human. The washing of the hair is almost parallel to the washing of the feet. And what does it even look like for your hair to be this place where you find your identity in God? And that process of being transformed in the chair when you're getting your hair done is almost the same thing as supposed to happen when you're doing Eucharist on a Sunday, to be transformed. And so I say the mundane is where God is every single day, and our daily acts of getting up, drinking coffee, going for a run, God is there. So that's what I've been working through.
Awesome. Thanks y'all for that. As we wrap up in kind of the next 10 minutes, I do have a couple questions, but we also encourage the awesome comments that y'all are making in the chat box. So feel free to get that going. This is another question I want to pose to y'all. And this was one of the questions submitted before the panel. But in what ways does queer liberation theology necessitate the abolition of police and the prison industrial complex, settler colonial nations, and coloniality? That can be a 3-hour-long panel, so I recognize that there's so much to untangle there, and how there's so much to untangle there. So any words that y'all have to offer in regards to abolition and queer liberation theology?
I hate to keep on jumping in, but I just want to acknowledge, not only in terms of, you know, sort of, I mean, just a lot of the post-colonial comments that I've seen, you know, and Nathan, I think, you know, your work in terms of post-colonial queer, you know, for me, I'm really interested, especially sort of the Anglican communion that grew out of, you know, colonialism and empire, right? And I think, you know, in my view, you know, Michel Foucault and this notion of power as, you know, sort of constructed in terms of knowledge and, you know, sort of what seems natural, whether it's disparaging people on the basis of race or ethnicity, or, you know, sort of the native versus the imperial and sexuality are really intertwined, right? And we're still dealing with that today. And so I'd say for me, you know, beyond just a matter of, you know, liberation, it really is interrogating how power, you know, operates, right, through these categories of race and sexuality and all that. And so I think, you know, to answer the question, I think we have to look at these things in an interconnected, intersectional matrix kind of way.
Yeah, this is like such an essential question as well. I think like as queer people, whether we're religious or not, I think as queer people, we have an obligation to be students of abolition, and we have an obligation to be anti-colonial, because we stand on the shoulders of like trans women of color who have like made it possible for queer people to thrive in the ways that we do today. And we stand on the shoulders of indigenous traditions since the beginning of time, where like indigenous communities recognize so many genders and so many kinds of relationships and so many leadership roles and so many ways of collaborating. And so those histories, I think, really ought to compel us as queer people to continue fighting for real justice and real change. And as a Christian, I and as a trans person, it's been so grounding and groundbreaking and important for me to learn more about like the really arbitrary and very recent colonial constructs of gender, and like that's not like normal in the history of human experience for us to try to fit ourselves into two boxes. And when we think about like church history and like gender queer people have always existed. And so there's never been a time where like we were new to the scene or new to God. Like we're not like some surprise in the 21st century that God wasn't expecting. So knowing that, and knowing that queer people have always been part of Christianity is like important to engage. Yeah, I don't want to take up all the time left, but.
This is a really complex question. I don't even think I can answer it within the 2 sentences that I have, but I just think to what Carter has said, but also the power of just naming things and knowing that there's no absolute truth, and that there are many truths, and that we should be able to hold all those truths in which what was given to us, and being able to name those things. And so I think to that, my simplest is being able to say, I got something to say, and that is against the powers that be, and how hard that is to do that. And that the work that we're trying to do and continuously are doing every single day is exhausting, but it needs to happen because people are screaming to be liberated. People want to be seen and heard. And so that's what I can say to that right now.
Awesome. Thanks y'all for that. And yeah, I just want to echo what Nordia said. There's so much to untangle there that can't be addressed in like the last 6-ish minutes that we have. But just final 2 questions for y'all. The first one being, what have been your sources of strength, hope, and spiritual nourishment as a queer Christian? So what gives y'all life as a queer Christian? Feel free to talk about practices or theologies that are embedded in you. or things that you came to terms to as a queer Christian?
I can go. So particularly having a spiritual counselor has been such a monumental difference for me, being able to have language to talk with her. And she's also a queer Black woman, and we come from the same background and we understand God in the same terms of growing up in the Black church. And so it has particularly been fundamental to my sanity, and knowing that I'm held and that I'm loved, and that, like we were talking about earlier, like my bodily knowledge, like my body knew something was wrong, and being able to be affirmed in that space has been really helpful. But also using other practices through like poetry and like literature, particularly Parable of a Sower, has been monumental to me, also in my practices. And also tarot card reading. Growing up, I was told it's demonic. A tarot card reader will read you and will get you right. So I just think that has been so helpful to me, at least, being able to dismantle these misconceptions about what is able to see God, but like being able to practice that through my hair, going into the barber shop, or just being poured into by my chosen family. And the hope that I get is by when I volunteer with a particular LGBTQ community of youth, and they range from like 6 years old, kind of, I think 6 to like 21, and they just give me so much power to be able to like, wow, you already are naming yourself and you are standing in that at such a like young age, and being able to say that age does not define what kind of wisdom and when and where and how you're able to walk into that bodily knowledge and knowing for a fact you know who you are. And so those have been placements of life for me, and I'm continuously finding new ways. So if anyone wants to drop in the chat the ways that you are spiritually nourished, I would love to know. I'm always trying to put something in my resource toolbox. So thank you.
Yeah, reading, just like getting my hands on books by queer people of faith has been so helpful before I came to seminary, and in seminary too, and being able to dive deep into like how queer Christians are making sense of all of these questions, and bringing their unique life experiences to their spiritual practices and their communities. There's nothing, and it's kind of like, it's like going to a support group, or like, you know, hanging out with your people. Like there's nothing like being able to see, oh, that person has a experience that speaks to me, and oh, there's like this other way of being, or this other way of thinking that I hadn't considered before. It's so life-giving to be able to expand your awareness of what's possible.
I guess I'd say just in terms of not feeling alone, you know, role models in terms of courage. But I also like, you know, in terms of queer theory, you know, this idea of difficult, complicated feelings, you know, people that have been able to express their anger, their shame, you know, frustration, and having the courage to share that and be vulnerable. That really has given me a lot of strength and just community. So those are some things.
Awesome. Thanks y'all for that. And to kind of wrap us up, I was just curious, do y'all have any final words? Maybe we can do 30 seconds each. Just any final words that y'all want to offer to our beloveds who are listening tonight, or a message that you would love for them to take away from this conversation? Carter, could I start with you on this one?
Yes. You are divine, and you are it's important that you're here and you have something to share with the world about who God is and what faith can look like. And we all need each other. We need to be practicing faith in community so that we can continue to blow each other's minds with how amazing God is.
Awesome. Nordia or Patrick, yeah.
You know, I just say, I believe that God is love, 1 John. And, you know, in terms of being part of the Christian tradition, so often the binary of us versus them, or, you know, we are part of the tradition, we are part of the body. And it's just important to acknowledge that, and don't let anyone ever tell you that you're not part of that tradition. And you have a voice and it deserves to be heard.
I would say your life is worship, and you worship God through your ability to be authentic every single day. And I hope that you give yourself the grace to continue to show up, whatever that looks like. And you know who God is. Don't let people out here tell you you don't. In the most simplest way I can do it. And your queerness allows you to see God in so much more ways than anybody could ever tell you. And yeah, you know who God is. That's it.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Y'all, can we give it up for our panelists tonight? Y'all are a breath of fresh air. I'm thankful for the wisdom that y'all passed onto all of us today, everything that we learned from y'all. But for now, I'll go ahead and pass this over to Erin.
Oh, I am so full. Wow. Thank you all so much. What a gift this conversation was. What a gift each of you are. I am just overwhelmed with gratitude. Thank you to all of our panelists, Patrick, Carter, Nordia, to Nathan for your moderating, to all of you for your questions. I want to acknowledge there was a lot of things that came up in the chat that we didn't get to, but this is the first of many conversations. I hope to continue this conversation. There's so much more that we can talk about here, and I'm just so excited to do this with you all. So thank you all so much for being here tonight. Want to thank and acknowledge those who are joining us from other student Christian movements. I know we have some folks from Student Christian Movement of Cuba that are here tonight. We're so glad that you could join us. And just a few quick announcements before we close out our time, because I do know it is at time. We hope you will join us. Our next event, we have a global prayer gathering on Monday, October 25th at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, open to all. There's information on our website, which is WSCF-trustees.org. If you want to know about other events that we have going on, you can sign up for our email announcements. There's a link on our website under the Contact Us tab, and you can get all of the updates. Don't worry, we don't send like tons of emails, but you can at least find out when we have more information, more events like this happening. We also have an Instagram that you can follow at WSCF.USA, as well as a Facebook group called Friends of the WSCF. So those are all the ways that you can learn about what's going on and future upcoming events that we have. Again, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you, Nathan, and thank you to you all for being here tonight. We're so grateful.